What is up, YouTube? So here's a site you haven't seen before. I promised you there was a saltwater tank in the making, and I was going to go a little bit more into it, and I finally got the time now to make the video. So here's what we're looking at, right? This is my 10-gallon Nano Reef, and it is literally my experiment. I just want to be clear on that. I am experimenting with how to keep a saltwater aquarium. So this is not going to be perfect. There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm learning about it as I go. I'm doing tons and tons of reading on it. I realize that everybody out there who might be watching this could possibly have a different opinion on what's going on in my tank and what I should do or not do. But let's keep the comments civil. Opinions are a dime a dozen. What I'm trying to get to is a very easy to maintain saltwater aquarium, as easy as is reasonably possible. And I'm trying to do it with the same ideas that Wallstead has put into her aquarium in terms of low maintenance and a balanced ecosystem. So let me give you a little breakdown of what I've done. This tank was started in November of 2011, and so it's a little bit over 3 months old, and the majority of rock that's in here is dry limestone rock, what we call Florida rock down here in Florida. It's pretty much calcium carbonate, old reef rock, you know, several thousand to a million plus years old, what have you. It is all coral based. Sometimes you can see a lot of coral in it. So I started with that, and that's pretty easy to find down here. I can get it at like Lowe's or Home Depot. For those of you who are outside the Florida area or areas that sell it rock regularly, you know, sometimes you might find that at a landscape. But I started with that. And the reason why I started with that is because I was trying to be conscious about the ecology and, you know, pulling rocks out of existing coral reefs, etc. But, you know, it's always nice to say that. But the real reason, aside from that, is I didn't want to introduce, or I wanted to minimize the introduction of aquarium pests, the hitchhikers, as they like to call them, all the bad hitchhikers. So I really wanted to minimize that. And so that's why I went with the majority of dry rock for this. I did, however, of course, introduce one piece of live rock. I went with a relatively small piece for a couple of different reasons. One, because obviously I wanted it to seed the dry rock, and by that I mean all the microorganisms, bacteria, etc. that live in the live rock, taken from the ocean, would eventually migrate over and start living and colonizing the dead rock. So of course you need something. So I had to get a piece of live rock, smallest piece possible, minimize the amount of pests that I might introduce. Things like mantis shrimp and Aptasia anemones and a whole bunch of other stuff that I've been reading about. So again, I'm not an expert, but I'm learning as I go. Okay, so here's the deal. And this is probably going to shock the shit out of people, okay? I am running this tank with tap water. And before you start thumbing me down for saying tap water is bad, tap water is evil, etc., realize this. Number one, I live in Florida. We have extremely hard water. We have a lot of phosphates in our water. I know all of this. I'm totally aware of what I am doing. Remind you, it's an experiment for me, okay? I'm making sure that my ammonia and my nitrates are zero. They are right now. They always have been after the tank cycled. A lot of this is me learning about what it really means to use, you know, tap water versus RODI, etc., okay? What I have found so far, and by the way, I don't do water changes either. I haven't changed an ounce of water. I just top off, okay? So I'm using fresh water that's treated to top it off. And I'll also add the caveat that you will probably not have the same experience with your tap water in your area, wherever you live in the world, as I do with mine. Everybody's going to be different. So it really is something that you have to look into and be comfortable with trying out. What I am finding is a lot of what is said is true. Tap water contains a fair amount of phosphates and a fair amount of silicates that will contribute to algae growth. Now what I am finding is my algae growth is really not that bad. You'll see on the substrate I've got a lot of diatoms, brown diatoms blooming, but you will notice on the rocks I do not. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. Number one, the green algae is now outcompeting the brown algae, the diatoms, for space on that rock. Okay, it has matured. The other is the snails that I have are Florida turbo snails, are making short work of the diatoms on the rock itself. Okay, and I have about 3 snails in here. Now, what's interesting about this is they don't really touch the diatoms on the substrate. I find that kind of interesting. I think it's because it's grainy and they don't necessarily like it. There are a couple of snail species out there that I'm going to try to introduce that will graze exclusively on kind of what I would call medium grain substrates to get rid of that algae. But then probably a lot of people are, big proponents of reverse osmosis, deionized water, for just that reason, to remove the silicates, to remove the phosphates, etc. But then what I found, what I was reading, and this is what drove me to trying tap water, is they go through all this work to remove all impurities from the water, to introduce it, to help control the scenario, but then you reintroduce some of the major components like calcium, etc., to bring it back up. So I consider myself lucky with the Florida water that I can actually try this. A lot of people wouldn't be able to with soft water, but I really thought that Florida water was a really great start. Mainly in the Tampa area, we have some pretty hard water, so I wanted to give it a shot. And so far for me, it's working out really well. Okay. The other thing that I want to talk about a little bit is the idea behind it, the balanced aquarium. So I have a little bit of a different perspective, I think, than most people. I don't find it a problem that I have a reasonable amount of algae growth. And when I say reasonable, I mean it's not blowing up all over the place. It's well contained. It's moderate growth at best. And to me, that is more natural than no algae growing whatsoever, for a couple of different reasons. One being, from everything I've read, that is the natural progression of colonization of rock in the ocean. It goes from microorganisms to macroorganisms, etc. So the algae growing in the rock is a little bit more natural. The other thing I'm kind of curious about as time goes on is how the growth of algae affects algae or herbivorous fish that you would introduce, like tangs and other fish that would normally eat some of these algae, either the macroalgae or the microalgae, what have you. It seems to me that if you can maintain growth and it's reasonable, that it adds to the ecosystem. And again, I'm going to go back to the Wallstead method, which, by the way, for saltwater, they sort of have the same mantra in something called the Berlin method, which promotes the use of live rock and surface area for bacteria growth, etc., which is perfectly fine and makes perfect sense. And definitely read up on that if you're interested in saltwater. I think it's a great way to keep things. So I think it's pretty reasonable. Yeah, it may not look as pretty to some people. To me, it sort of looks natural, right? I think once I get another species of snail in there, it'll minimize the growth quite a bit on the substrate, and that should help maintain it. So my idea is I want to build an ecosystem. I want to have microfauna, macrofauna, the right amount of fish for a tank, not a heavy load. Again, going back to Wallstead, a very light load of fish, and really minimize all the things that are so expensive in a saltwater aquarium that I think in some cases might be a little bit unnecessary. Protein skimmers, I understand what they're used for. I don't see the need for it if you go with a light load of fish. I think as you want to introduce more fish to an aquarium, much like you would in a freshwater aquarium, obviously the biological load increases, and you've got to have a way to get that out. Canister filters in freshwater are pretty typical. Protein skimmers are looking to all to pull that extra protein out and keep your nitrates down. I'm a bigger fan of trying to work into natural ways to manage your nitrates, to manage your protein or your dissolved organic carbon or anything like that. And I think a lot of it has to do with being reasonable about how many fish you put in a tank, because a fish tank is not the ocean, and most of these fish that you buy, even one fish, will likely in its life in an ocean swim in a much bigger area than the biggest fish tank you could put in your house. So I think to be reasonable about it, I'm going minimal on the fish. And again, this is my proving ground. This is where I'm testing out my theories. I'm learning as I go. I'm learning about, what out there that I read is correct, what out there that I read is incorrect or misleading maybe, and taking it slow. So let's talk about some of the progress I've made, some of the good progress I've made. I think again, I haven't done any water changes. My fish are happy. My ammonia is 0. My nitrates are 0. The live rock that I've introduced, I specifically picked because of the purple coralline algae on it. And you can see on this rock in particular in the front, there's a good strong growth of purple coralline algae on it. And that rock, which formerly was bright white and a dead rock, is nearly alive and black enough that you can't tell the difference between that rock and the live rock. Really good. Interestingly enough, obviously, as you move out past the live rock, it gets a little bit whiter, but you can see I've got nice strong green algae growth. Again, there's purple coralline algae growing there. We've got more over here, so it's spreading, which is really good. It's telling me that I'm introducing at least the right amount of chemicals in the water in terms of calcium, iodine, etc., for healthy growth for the purple coralline algae. The first fish I introduced was the Royal Grama. There she is right there. My wife calls her Fifi. She has been the longest resident of the tank, just shortly after the tank cycled. The tank took about 3 weeks to cycle. And along with her, I also got, you can see Jacques, the coral-banded shrimp. My kids named him, of course, after Nemo. And then our little clownfish there. Okay. Now, these are the only inhabitants I have in the tank, and I just recently added a few weeks ago an LPS or a long polyp stony coral called a torch coral right there, because I'm trying to make sure I understand how to maintain the tank not only for fish but also for coral, because my plan is to have a LPS and soft coral dominated tank. I chose that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I actually happen to like the flowy, soft nature of the LPS corals and the soft corals. I like the way they look, and I also took into account the light demands. The other half of the coral world, the SPS or small polyp stony corals, are very demanding when it comes to light, and they're very demanding when it comes to water flow. And being that I was new to the aquarium world in terms of saltwater, and given the amount of equipment I would have had to purchase and light intensity that I would have had to produce, it sort of pulled me away from the SPS world. And to be honest with you, I really preferred the LPS corals. I just, at the time, didn't realize it because I didn't know the difference between the two. So that was probably a really interesting aspect of what I chose. Now, let's talk a little bit about the basics of what I'm doing here. I mentioned before I'm not doing water changes. I haven't done a single water change in this aquarium. I merely top it off. Now, with salt water, the one thing you got to remember, I know I got a lot of freshwater viewers, so I'll mention some of the differences. There's no real big differences in my mind between saltwater and freshwater. The only major difference I see in terms of monitoring water quality, etc., is salinity. Okay, so salinity is, obviously the amount of salt or salt in parts per million in the water itself, and they measure that through a measurement called specific gravity, which basically weighs the water. Okay. Obviously, if your water has more content in it, the specific gravity is going to be a little bit higher. Salt raises it. Water has a specific gravity of 0 based off of the gauge, and salt water will actually go a little bit higher. Okay. So you measure that with a couple of different tools. One is a refractometer. That's the more advanced tool. I plan on getting one when I get a little bit more into it, but for right now I use the pretty typical hydrometer you could get at like Petco, things like that. I do recommend reading the reviews and getting a quality one that people like. So measuring the specific gravity of the water helps. That tells you that helps you figure out the salinity content of the water. You do want to keep that at a certain level. You don't want it to go up or down past that level too much. The fish and the corals are pretty tolerant of it, but you do want to manage that. When I first got into it, I was a little worried about that because I'm like, well, how am I going to know how much salt to add or anything like that? But you know, as you learn some of the more obvious things, such as evaporation. Well, salt doesn't evaporate from the tank. Salt stays in the water. Only the water evaporates. So guess what that means? As your tank evaporates, your salt content is actually going to go up because you're losing water. So your makeup water or your top off water that you use is actually fresh water. Okay, that was a big bonus for me to understand that because it became a little bit easier. I was a little worried that I would always have to mix a specific ratio of salt to water and maintain that and keep volumes of water around just in case and things like that. Not the case. Only when you're taking out water and adding back water do you have to maintain that salinity level, right? And honestly, I've done that once. Where I took out some water and had to put some water back in because of a new fish I was introducing. But honestly, it wasn't that bad. It took a little bit of experimenting on my part to mix it and test the salinity, et cetera, and put it back in, but it wasn't that bad. So overall, it's been really good. So again, this is my little prototype. This is my little experiment to get through a lot of theory and a lot of understanding and a lot of misinformation that's out there on the internet. I want to point out also, there's a channel on YouTube, a guy called New York Stilo, and I think you're a subscriber too, so thank you. He is my inspiration for keeping this tank, and I don't do everything he says. I'm trying a couple of different things on my own just to see how they work, but he is very, very spot on when it comes to the same ideas and the same concepts around not needing water changes, things like that. He's a little bit more advanced, obviously, than I am, to say the least. But I'm getting there, right? I'm working on it. I'm learning as I go, and I'm getting comfortable with the knowledge. Just because somebody can tell you something doesn't mean that you should run out and do it. I feel that I need to be a little bit more comfortable with understanding it and how it works, etc., before I jump in and do it. But all things being said, I think it's going really well. So with that, and we'll come back to this tank and I'll talk a little bit more about it. I've been talking for a while about it. The next video that I'm going to be putting up is just going to be a short video that talks about the big project, the big saltwater tank. So this is all leading up to a much bigger project, and I'll be uploading that shortly. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it pretty interesting. I definitely recommend, and there's a lot of good saltwater channels out there, but if you're really interested in hearing more about a low maintenance type of saltwater aquarium, by all means follow what I'm doing. Definitely go check out New York Stilo. He's got a great set of videos on that. A lot of good stuff, and I will talk to everybody later. Thanks. Bye.